What's going on, everyone? It's Adrian from Draft Time, and welcome to another picks video. Now, in this video, I'm going to go over the main FanDuel slate for tonight. It starts at 7:30, and we got a nice little four-game slate. You also got two primetime TNT games. You got the Celtics at the Bucks, and then you got the Suns at the Lakers. So there's a lot of star power tonight. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So first of all, as far as injuries are concerned, you got Luka. He's out tonight, so that has a pretty big impact on the Dallas game. And then you got no Al Horford for the Celtics tonight. So as far as questionable guys, no one's really questionable except LeBron James, but he's always questionable. I'm pretty sure he's going to end up playing the game. So let's go ahead and take a look at the top value plays for tonight. And the top value pick, that's going to be Jaden Hardy for Dallas, obviously with no Luca. Last game, there was no Luca. He went off for like 42. And then you got Julius Randle. He's under $9,000 now, which is a pretty good price for him. And he's been doing pretty well recently. Uh, he's averaging uh, he's averaging 43.37 over his last 10 games, and then he's going against the Mavericks tonight, who actually allow the fifth most points, fancy points, to opposing power forwards. And then the third top value pick, that's going to be Shea Gilgeous-Alexander. He's 11,300, and he's projected to score nearly 60. So there's not a whole lot of value right now, even with no Luca, because everyone's pretty expensive. But anyways, let me go ahead and talk about my sleeper pick for the night, and that's going to be either from Milwaukee. That's either going to be Pat Connaughton or Malik Beasley. And the reason I'm picking those two is they're both pretty cheap. Malik Beasley is 4,500. Pat Connaughton is 3,800. And I think both of them have a chance to end up finishing this game tonight against Boston, closing out the game. Either of them have a chance of doing it. I suspect it's going to be Malik Beasley, but there's a small chance it could be Pat Connaughton. And on a smaller slate tonight, like tonight, if either of those guys give you 25 plus, they could end up being in the number one lineup. So those are my sleeper picks for tonight, especially since Boston's probably going to close out the game with a pretty small lineup, especially with no Al Horford. Um, so maybe a guy like Bobby Portis is on the bench in the fourth quarter, and one of these two guys is in. So those are going to be my sleeper picks for tonight. But anyways, let's go ahead and let's take a look at the first game. You got Boston at Milwaukee, and let's take a look at Boston. Um, Now for Boston, they play at a pretty average pace, but they have a really good defense. They allow the third fewest points per game, and then Milwaukee, they play at the third fastest pace, and they allow the seventh most points per game. Now, I expect this to be a very competitive game. Obviously, these are two teams, number one and number two in the Eastern Conference. The Bucks are 4 games behind the Celtics, so this is going to be a very competitive game. So even though there's not a whole lot of value on the Celtics, even with Al Horford out, I still think that there's value in picking up some of these Celtics guys, especially some of these stars, because they're going to play pretty big minutes if this game is competitive, which I expect it to be. So you got Tatum at 10,400. He's on a nice little stretch. He's scored 50 plus in 4 straight games. So like I said earlier, these stars, someone like Tatum could end up playing a lot of minutes. So he's worth picking up. Jaylen Brown is worth picking up at 8,400 because he could play a lot of minutes. Same goes with Porzingis. He's coming off a 44.7 point game, and there's not a whole lot of options at power forward or center tonight. So I really like Porzingis. Derek White at 7,600, I'm not crazy about. Maybe you put him in one or two lineups, but I'm not crazy about him at that price. And then you got Drew Holiday, $7,000. Um, I actually think he might be worth picking up in a few lineups, especially since he's going up against his former team in Milwaukee. We'll see if he could get going. And like I said earlier, he might end up playing big minutes. So he might be worth it on such a small slate at only $7,000. So, I'm not going crazy with Celtics players, maybe, no more than two players from the Celtics. Uh, Luke Cornett, he might end up getting pretty big minutes with no with no Al Horford, but I don't foresee him, closing out the game and playing big fourth quarter minutes. I think it's going to be these five who end up closing out the game tonight. So, although he might end up having pretty good value at only $4,300, I don't think someone like Cornette could break the slate tonight. So let's go ahead and take a look at Milwaukee. So, like I mentioned earlier, A lot of these stars on Milwaukee are going to end up playing pretty big minutes. They're 4 games behind Boston right now, and they could get within 3 with a win. So this is a pretty big game for them. Giannis could easily give you 70, so you got to pick up some Giannis. Dame, $8,700. I think he's worth it. Although he is going to have Drew Holiday guarding him, so that's going to be tough for someone like Dame. But maybe you put him in a couple of lineups in case he gives you 50, which he's capable of. Chris Middleton at 7,200. He had a big game last game, but that was with no Damian Lillard. I don't really see Middleton having that high of a ceiling. Then you got Brooke Lopez, $6,500. Maybe you put him in one or two lineups at that center spot because there's not a whole lot of center options tonight. But I like someone like Nurkic better for the center position, who's only $200 more. So I'm not going to go that heavy on Brooke Lopez. Bobby Portis, you always have to pick him up because you never really know when he's going to give you that huge game. Although he's on a pretty bad stretch right now. And like I said earlier, I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't close out the fourth quarter and Malik Beasley or Pat Connaughton do, which is why I like these guys as sleeper picks. But no one else really worth picking up on Milwaukee. And that takes us to the next game. You got Portland at Oklahoma City. Now, Portland, they play at a pretty average pace and they have a pretty average defense. And then OKC, they play at the seventh fastest pace and they have a pretty average defense. So for Portland, you got Anthony Simons at $8,000. I like his upside. 48 points from him would mean that he's hitting 6x value, and he's done that 3 times in his 15 games this season. So you got to have some Anthony Simons, but I'm not going to have that much of him. And I think the same goes to Jeremy Grant. Uh, he's kind of a boomer bust kind of guy. You would need him to score around 44 to give you 6x value, and he's done that 5 times this season, so he's capable of it. But he's also capable of having some duds. Look at this game right here, 11 points. His last game was 22 points. But like I said, at 7,400, if he gives you 44, which he can do, then he could end up being in the number one lineup. Scoot at 6,400, I think that's too much for him. Maybe you put him in one or two lineups just in case he gives you 35 plus, which he's done a couple times in the last 10 games. Now you got Reith. He's coming off a pretty poor game last game. Only played 20 minutes. Those minutes actually went to this guy, Ibu Baji. I don't know how you pronounce his name. He actually played 27 minutes, finished with 26.7. So maybe you lock in this guy right here, Baji, into one lineup just in case he ends up playing more minutes again than Reith. Maybe you lock in Reith to one lineup just in case they go back to him. But I'm not going crazy with either of these guys. Shaden Sharp at 6,600. I think that's too expensive. Kamara at $4,800. I definitely think he has some upside, especially at that small forward spot where there's not a whole lot of value at small forward tonight, and he's logging pretty heavy minutes. He's averaging 27 minutes per game in his past 5 games, and then no one else is worth it. Brogdon 6,100. I mean, he hasn't been doing anything lately. And like I mentioned earlier, you got Shea Gilgis Alexander. He's one of the top value plays of the night, but he is projected to be 61.69% owned. So he is very fade worthy. And maybe you want to consider fading him for someone like a Kyrie Irving, who is significantly cheaper. And Kyrie Irving could easily outscore SGA tonight, especially with no Luka. So you might want to consider fading Shea Gilgis Alexander. Otherwise, he's definitely worth picking up. Could easily be the top performer of the night. Chet Holmgren is definitely worth picking up at $8,500 at that center spot because he could easily be the top scoring center of the night. Jalen Williams at $7,800. That's pretty expensive, but he is on a nice stretch right now. He's had back-to-back games over 47 fantasy points, so maybe you consider putting him in one or two lineups. Otherwise, I think that is kind of expensive. Josh Giddey at $6,800. He's not playing any more than 20 minutes, so I don't really think he has that high of an upside. Then you got Dort at 5,700. Maybe you put him in one or two lineups, but I'm not crazy about him at that price. But he does give you decent minutes, and there's not a whole lot of value at shooting guard or small forward tonight. So maybe you do consider someone like Dort, just because he's going to be low owned, and it's a small slate with not a lot of value. And that's pretty much it for OKC. No one else is worth picking up. And let's go ahead and take a look at the next game. You get the Knicks at Dallas. So you got the Knicks, who play at the fourth slowest pace, and they allow the seventh fewest points per game. So they're a pretty good defense. And then you got Dallas. They play at the 10th fastest pace, and they allow the 10th most points per game. Now you got Julius Randle. Under $9,000 is a very good price for him. So he's going to end up being in a ton of people's lineups. Maybe you consider fading him because he's going to be pretty heavily owned. Um, but that's a very good price for him. So I'm going to have a lot of Julius Randle. I'm also going to have a decent amount of Jalen Brunson at $9,000. He's been on a pretty good stretch recently, except his last game against Portland, he had a pretty bad game. But besides that, he's on a pretty nice stretch. And I think $9,000 is a decent price for him. Isaiah Hartenstein, $7,700. That's a lot of money for him, but he is on a nice stretch, averaging 42.7 over his last 5 games. So maybe I pick him up in one or two lineups. OG Anunoby, $6,200 is right around. I think that his price is right. I'll end up picking him up in one or two lineups just because there's not a lot of value at shooting guard or small forward tonight. Um, but I'm not going to go crazy with OG. Dante DiVincenzo at $5,200. Only projected to score 23.41. I don't really think he's worth it. Although it's interesting, he does get picked up by the optimizer just because there's not a lot of options there. So he might be someone you want to fade since he does end up getting picked up by the optimizer. Josh Hart, the same goes to him. $5,000. He's not going to be that much of a sleeper tonight because he'll end up getting picked up by a lot of people. So maybe you want to fade him if he gets picked up by the optimizer. Then you got Quentin Grimes at $4,100. I don't think he has that much upside, even though he had a pretty good game last game. He finished with 30 points, but he's just not getting the minutes to justify um, picking him up. And then no one else on New York is worth picking up. And that takes us to Dallas. Like I mentioned earlier, you got no Luka tonight, so Kyrie is definitely worth picking up. You got Tim Hardaway Jr., who since Kyrie has returned hasn't been doing much, but now you have no Luka, so now his minutes might go back up. So you might want to consider some Tim Hardaway, but I'm not going to go too crazy with him. Derrick Jones Jr. at 5,600, you want to consider him in some of your lineups. He's definitely worth picking up in a couple of lineups, and I think the optimizer actually ends up picking him up. Jaden Hardy, he's the top value play of the night with no Luka. And last game without Luka, he played 32 minutes, finished with 42.3 fantasy points. So he's worth picking up. Although maybe you want to consider fading him in case he has a dud, which he's done before in games without Luka. Then you got Dwight Powell. $4,800 is a very good price for him. He's probably going to get picked up by the optimizer. I'm probably going to fade him in a few just because I don't think he has that much of an upside. Then you got Josh Green. I'll pick him up in a few lineups. I'm not going to go too crazy with Dallas players going against the Knicks, who, like I mentioned before, have a pretty good defense. So I'm going to cap it out at two Dallas players against this Knicks defense. Even though there's no Luka, it's still a very good defense that they're going against, and everyone's not exactly cheap. You got Grant Williams, who's questionable. If he does end up missing the game, then all these guys they're going to get a slight boost, but not too much of a boost. So I really don't think it makes that much of a difference in your decision making process. I don't think anyone else is really worth picking up. And that takes us to the last game of the night. You got Phoenix at the Lakers. Now you got Phoenix, they play at the eighth slowest pace, and they have a pretty average defense. And then you got the Lakers, they play at the eighth fastest pace, and they also have a pretty average defense. For Phoenix, you got KD, he's under $10,000. So you always have to consider some KD when he's under 10,000 because he could easily drop 55 plus. Devin Booker at 9,600, same goes to him. Nurkic is going to be very heavily owned because he's the top valued center of the night. So maybe you fade him, maybe for someone like Brooke Lopez, who's $200 cheaper, who could outscore Nurkic. But I do think $6,700 is a very good price for Nurkic. He's coming off a pretty bad game, which is why he's so cheap. But look at the game before that, 49.3. So I like Nurkic. Bradley Beal hasn't done much since Kevin Durant's returned. He's got two 25-point games in the last two games since Durant's come back. So I don't think that there's much upside for Bradley Beal at $7,100 with Kevin Durant playing. Grayson Allen plays pretty big minutes. At $5,400, you might want to consider him since, like I mentioned earlier, there's not a whole lot of value at shooting guard or small forward. Um, but I'm not going to go too crazy with Grayson Allen, even though he's probably going to end up playing pretty big minutes and obviously closing out this game, which should be a pretty competitive game, TNT nationally televised against the Lakers. And he's probably going to close out the fourth quarter. So maybe you put him in a few lineups. Eric Gordon, I really don't think there's much of a need for him with all these scorers on this team. I mean, really, Eric Gordon's only going to give you scoring, and they got three guys now with Kevin Durant back who could score. Durant, Booker, and Bradley Beal. So I don't think Aaron Gordon's worth playing at all at $5,100. Now, Josh Okogie is interesting at 4,100. I don't expect him to do much, but perhaps they end up closing the game with him and not Grayson Allen if Grayson Allen ends up having a bad game. So maybe in one lineup, just to go out on a flyer, you fade Grayson Allen and you lock in Josh Okogie. So I might do that for one lineup. And that's pretty much it for the Suns. No one else is really worth picking up. But let's go ahead and take a look at the Lakers now. And for the Lakers, you got Anthony Davis coming off a pretty big game last game, 63 points. He's also had a 77 and an 81 point game in his last 10 games. So you definitely have to pick him up in a few lineups. You got LeBron James at $10,000. That's a pretty decent price for him, projected at 50.54. So maybe you pick him up. Maybe he ends up getting picked up by the optimizer. I don't think he does. No, he doesn't get picked up by the optimizer. So maybe you lock him into a few lineups just in case he gives you 55 plus, which he's capable of. Austin Reeves, they've had him over $7,000 recently, but now they got him under $7,000. So I think he's worth picking up in a few lineups. Could end up logging pretty big minutes. So, I think he might be worth picking up in a few lineups. D'Angelo Russell at $6,000. He's hasn't been really doing much lately. So I'm not crazy about D'Angelo Russell. So I don't think he's worth it. Maybe put him in one lineup just in case he goes off. Um, Turian Prince at $4,900. Um, I actually like him a lot because he's going to play pretty big minutes tonight against the Suns and probably going to end up closing out the game. So he could easily give you, 27. If he does that, then he's probably going to end up being in the top lineup. So I definitely think he's worth locking into a few lineups. Christian Wood, I don't think is worth it at $5,000. He's not going to give you that many minutes. Cam Reddish is questionable. Maybe if he ends up missing the game, you consider some Jared Vanderbilt. Maybe he'll get a few more minutes and he's only $4,000. And who knows, maybe he even ends up closing out the game. So maybe you take a flyer on Jared Vanderbilt if Reddish ends up missing. Otherwise, if Reddish plays, I don't think Vanderbilt's worth it at all. And then no one else on the Lakers are really worth it. And that's pretty much it for all of the games tonight. Now let's go ahead and run one lineup just to see what it spits out. And you got Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, Bradley Beal, Jaden Hardy, Grayson Allen, Derek Jones, Dante DiVincenzo, Julius Randle, Dwight Powell, and Yusuf Nurkic. So yeah, that's probably going to change before the game start. So make sure that you update your lineups. Make sure you're subscribed to Draft Time. You can sign up for a free 7-day trial if you're not already subscribed. And good luck to everyone tonight.